Thank, thank you again for being with us. This is the last presentation we have this year. It's part of a series of presentations we had. These last three presentations dealing first with how the carceral system of the U.S. was mounted and designed on the basis of mostly black bodies, with the war on drugs, and how that spread through Latin America and other countries. What was learned from that and then applied with real um, sophistication, and Dr. Maher is going to talk about that on the war on terror. We also had a presentation seeing how the systems and tactics and methods used on immigrant sex workers help also to design the systems that now we see being applied to immigrants. And the immigrants, it's one site where we are seeing the intersection of race, class. The last scene that we saw was with the Somalis, the reference of the Somalis by the president as garbage. And so all these that comes together on this administration, and what it's we expect us to the future, and this new year that will be a very complicated year, but a year of resistance. Today, Dr. Maher is going to talk about with us about her book and the issues around the book that she wrote. If you have not read the book, I think it's an incredible reading for the moment we are living. The book is called Innocent Until Proven Muslim. It gives us a clear picture of all these that is mobilized in different settings and for different reasons. Dr. Maher is a Muslim Arab American expert on institutional Islamophobia, the war on terror, and the counter-narrative work. She is the author of the book Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience since 9/11. She is the founder and executive director of the Muslim Counter-Public Lab. You could check that. Is also very interesting place of work. And she is also the steering committee member of the Guantanamo Survivors Fund. She has worked at a number of human rights social justice organizations, including the Institute for Policy Studies, the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, Government Accountability Project, Torture Abolition and Survivor Support Coalition, and the Center for Victim and Torture. We are so grateful that you, Dr. Maher, took the time to be with us and impart your knowledge on this subject that is deep and it's has a long experience with that issue of torture and make the other, and playing government playing with different communities in different levels of alienation and torture and persecution. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you so much for being here this morning. Thank you, Alvaro, for inviting me to present. I know that this has been a very challenging year. And it has been extremely difficult for, all of the communities from which we belong. And unfortunately, it seems to be that the violence is going to continue escalating. But as we, try to move forward to challenge and confront and contend with state violence, I think one of the most important things we can do is, really to be politically educated. And I appreciate working with you all and collaborating with you all, because one of the things that's most important, of course, in this moment is, solidarity and really understanding how our struggles are so interconnected, and, you know, what it means for us to show up for each other when we are being targeted. So I'm going to share my presentation. So give me 1 second so I can put it on the right slide. And so, as Alvaro mentioned, this is a presentation about my book, but also, my book was published 4 years ago, about 4 years ago. And, a lot of the violence is evolving and continuing in different ways. But what I tried to do in the book is to really create a framework for understanding the war on terror, not just in its manifestation as it was when I wrote the book, but also to sort of create a blueprint from which we could understand the war on terror in an ongoing way. So before I get into talking a lot and going through the presentation, um, I wanted to show you all a about 5-minute video, which is a timeline of the war on terror. It is called Shattering Justice and Remaking the Muslim Threat. And basically, it is a series of images that chronicle the war on terror and focus on the targeting of Muslims throughout the last 24 years, although the timeline stops at 2021 because we're building it still. But what I want you to think about when you're watching it is not only about how we got to where we are today, because, for example, when we talk about the Caribbean boat strikes, we can understand them as being enabled, right, and being facilitated because of the legal and policy infrastructure that has been in place because of the war on terror. So think about, how we got to where we are, and also what are some of the ways that the same violence that you'll see in the video is showing up. Okay. I think I actually have to stop sharing for a second so that I can put on the sounds. Give me 1 second. So I know that that was a heavy video, so feel free to drop any comments in the chat on, what you saw that, was that not necessarily resonated, but that really struck at you, or things you saw in terms of the way that we keep seeing the violence being replicated. So every year, as you all know, on September 11th, whoever is in the administration, whoever is governing the United States, since 9/11, of course, gives a statement, right? And, you know, the statement on 9/11 is meant to, reiterate the goals of the war on terror, to re-entrench this idea that the United States was this, victim, and of course, a victim that has been targeted in a way that no other country has been targeted before. And to sort of reassure Americans, right, that the government is going to do whatever it takes to get justice and vengeance for the attacks on 9/11. Of course, we're operating now 24 plus years after the war on terror was launched. And so it is incredible to see these same narratives being deployed year after year after year, right? And in the redeployment of the narratives annually, we can see how deeply entrenched this idea of the United States' victimhood is, and how it has used that as a rationale to continue its violence under the guise of the war on terror and combating the global terrorist threat. So we know that this, of course, started with President Bush. And in 2001, 9 days after the 9/11 attacks, President Bush gave a speech to a joint session of Congress in which he stated, "Our war on terror begins with Al Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. Whether we bring our enemies to justice or justice to our enemies, justice will be done." And so this is, of course, important, not only because he's essentially laying out the blueprint for a nebulous and never-ending war, but also because he talks about the concept of justice. Of course, justice is left undefined. And as we have learned throughout the years of the war on terror, and obviously throughout the history of this country in general, justice is whatever the country says is justice, right? It doesn't need to necessarily define what that means. It doesn't actually have to say anything beyond this is justice in order for Americans to believe that it is justice. So, what is the war on terror? This might seem like an easy question now that we're so far out. But one of the important things to remember is that, the war on terror has often been framed as a fight that has been fought overseas, right, and abroad. And we see it increasingly now in a more visible way that the war on terror is being fought domestically as well. Okay. And when I talk about the war on terror, I specifically talk about how the war on terror was launched domestically, simultaneous to the way the war was launched on foreign soil, okay, in other countries. And it's important to understand that because one of the ways that the government sort of seeks to divide communities is to make us feel as though what's happening over there is very different from what's happening over here, right? And you need not worry about what's happening over there. Just worry about what's happening here. And because the government also wants war to be invisible, right, in this country, because that's crucial for the support of what the United States is doing abroad, right? Because war can't be taxing on people. People shouldn't understand the consequences of war. Otherwise, they might be against it. But now we see, of course, in a very visceral way, how this war on terror is becoming such a big part of our daily lives. And arguably, right? Depending on what community you belong to, it has been a part of our lives, right? Since the 9/11 attacks. So, importantly, again, then here is that the war on terror is a multi-dimensional campaign, right? And again, it is a war that has been fought both domestically and abroad. When I started doing work on the war on terror, one of the things that I observed most notably is that Islamophobia was sort of left out of the equation in terms of how we understand the war. And when we look at the entire apparatus, including who it was meant to target initially, right? Muslims have been and continue to be, right, the primary victims. So it's important when we talk about the war on terror to really understand how crucial it is to understand Islamophobia. Just as you can't, for example, understand police brutality without an analysis of anti Blackness, the war on terror demands an understanding of Islamophobia. Sorry, my computer is very sensitive. So, what is Islamophobia? Okay, and there's numerous definitions of Islamophobia. I don't claim to have the definitive construction of Islamophobia, but what we're really trying to get at, right, is what does this anti-Muslim hatred look like? Anti-Muslim antagonism, right? What is it? And when I talk about in my book, I specifically talk about institutionalized Islamophobia. So the way that Islamophobia is embedded into policies and laws of the state. And it's based on a constructed hate and fear of Muslims. Some people don't like the construction of phobia because it implies an inherent hatred. So like agoraphobia, for example, it's something that you more or less can't control, right? It's something that you kind of have. Um, but I use the term Islamophobia because of the way that fear and hate are specifically constructed by the state to justify violence against Muslims. And when you see the kind of images and narratives that are circulated about Muslims, it's obvious that that would generate hate and fear, right? It's no surprise that that is the outcome. So Islamophobia is also based on certain social constructions of Islam and Muslims, right, as being violent, barbaric, uncivilized, opposed to normative democratic values. If you just do a Google search for Islam and democracy, you'll probably get like 6 billion different results because of the constant narrative that Islam is antithetical to democracy. Okay. Um, Islamophobia positions Muslims outside of moral boundaries, right? And as with all our communities, when our communities are positioned outside of certain moral boundaries, the violence that is inflicted on them is seen as just, right? It's not something that is worth condemnation, right? And when people are outside our moral communities, we just apply different standards of fairness and justice. Okay. So Islamophobia is also about the dehumanization of Muslims, right? And obviously it ranges from prejudice to discrimination to detention and even death. And the last thing is that, Islamophobia is a particular type of oppression that's rooted in anti-religious animus as well as anti-Blackness, nationalism, racism, xenophobia, and a lot of the other systems of oppression that capture this global Muslim community's very diverse identities, right? So in some ways it's difficult to isolate because you're not just treated poorly or targeted because you are Muslim, and sometimes it's because you're Black Muslim, right? And it's anti-Blackness and Islamophobia and the way that they operate together. But crucially, right, it's also about the way that Islam is constructed as a religion, right? It's not just about the people. I think this is a this is different, in my opinion, from something from oppression like anti-Semitism. because anti-Semitism is specifically about stereotypes and constructions of Jewish people that doesn't really address, it's not really about how Judaism as a religion is being constructed or the ideas that people have of Judaism as a religion. Whereas with Islamophobia, there are specific negative tropes of the religion itself and what the religion prescribes and dictates. So let's ground the war on terror. Has anyone heard of moral panics? If you have or have thoughts, you can just drop it in the chat. But moral panics are these situations where there is sort of a fear and anxiety that's generated about a group of people that is constructed as a threat to the social and moral order of a community, right? Obviously, this is happening right now in the ways that there is fear and anxiety that's being generated about immigrants. Who are immigrants? Why are they in this country, right? And so we see this playing out in real time, okay? And who is responsible for generating this fear, right? It's comes from the media, comes from politicians. We can look at people like Laura Loomer, right, who is an influencer and a moral entrepreneur to examine the rhetoric that is being put out about certain groups of people, again, to generate this fear. And the important thing here is that when you generate this fear, obviously, you're justifying violence against a particular group of people, right? And you're also detracting attention away from other important policy issues. So we know, for example, the economy is failing in the United States. But instead of addressing that, what is being done instead is to generate fear, suspicion, antagonism towards immigrants, and to justify the focus, therefore, on deportations and on threatening immigrant communities. What's the process of creating a moral panic? So this includes exaggeration of the threat, right? And we see that happening, right? We can see that with the war on terror. So when Bush, in the early stages of the war on terror, right, talked about defeating this global terrorist enemy, that's an exaggeration of the threat. Never mind the fact that the United States has continuously provoked and created the conditions from which political violence is arising. An overbroad definition of the social group. Who is this group that we're talking about, right? We can't just say, people that are, Muslim in this country, right? We're going to talk about terrorists. And because all Muslims have been constructed as terrorists, then this comes to encapsulate the whole group. What is the threat? What is the response going to be to the threat, right? The United States created an entire infrastructure and apparatus of the war on terror to deal with the quote terrorist threat. And 24 plus years later, they still have not defeated the quote terrorist threat. What they have done, though, is destroy millions of lives and spend trillions of dollars fighting this nebulous war. In this specific theory, they talk about a clear life cycle, and I don't think that we can apply that in particular to the war on terror because it has not had a clear life cycle. And from the onset, the war was designed to not have a clear time cycle, right? It was the cycle of time, the cycle of how long this war would last was defined as whenever this terrorist threat is again combated, and that's just never going to happen, at least insofar as the United States continues to wage war and violence and not actually address the conditions again that it's caused. So President Trump, early in January, right, when there was an attack in New Orleans, he talked about standing against the forces of radical Islamic terrorism. And this is a particular use of a term to scapegoat and justify violence against Muslims, right? Because it is attaching terrorism, radical, and Islam together such that terrorism is defined by its Muslim Islamic nature, right? And we can see this in many other instances. For example, when other acts of political violence that would be constructed as terrorism by the same standards are referred to as non-Islamic acts of terrorism, meaning that Islam is the gold standard for terrorism. And it is the original, Muslims are sort of the original purveyors of terrorism. And thus, everything that follows is simply compared to that, right? It doesn't have its own origins and roots. For example, white supremacist terrorism. And as a disclaimer, I don't agree with the term and construction of terrorism. But this is just to show the differential standards and continuous targeting of Muslims vis-a-vis this construction that continues to entrench Islam and Muslims again as the sole purveyors of a particular kind of violence. We're going to skip this one. So let's talk about the narrative infrastructure of the war on terror. And I think you'll see a lot of similarities here in terms of what is happening right now. And again, you know, this narrative infrastructure was meant to be enduring, okay? So not only was it created to justify the war on terror, right? It builds on narratives that have been deployed throughout this country's history, such as American exceptionalism. So I'm sure you all know about the other 9/11. So if you do know, drop it in the chat. What is the other 9/11 that preceded the US's 9/11? Does anyone know? Okay, well, I'm going to assume you all know. Yes,
Ending.
Chile. hmm So the reason this is important, right, is because if you read Bush's quote on the left, he really positions the United States as this victim, and this victim that has sort of never been seen before in the history of this country, okay, it's of the world. So he says night fell on a different world where freedom itself is under attack. Whereas other countries have experienced massive state violence, mass atrocities, the whole world does not change as a result of those acts of mass atrocities and mass state violence. But when the United States is a victim, it does. And that's why, if you go into most crowds, people probably don't know that there was a US backed coup in Chile on September 11th of 1973, because part of this narrative of victimhood involves positioning 9/11 as the day that people recognize and will continue to recognize till the end of history as the day the United States was attacked, and will not make any other associations with that day. So this is a quote from a book that is by Donald Krebs. I'm forgetting the exact title, but I'm happy to send references. But basically, what this quote talks about is the ways in which, national security narratives are designed to be constructed in ways that lead people to think they are a natural interpretation of an event. So you can have the facts of what happened on 9/11, right? So two planes hit the World Trade Center. a plane crashed into the Pentagon. But those acts by themselves do not have inherent meaning, right? And interpretation. Meaning and interpretation are ascribed to those events by those narrating the events. And so if you listened to the rhetoric of the attacks on 9/11, particularly from the States, right? The idea, of course, again, was that the United States was a blameless victim, okay? And in so doing, especially after the 9/11 attacks, immediately after the 9/11 attacks, anyone who tried to offer an alternative explanation besides they hate us for our freedom and democracy was immediately shut down, and there was immediate backlash because how dare you try to introduce another variable into the story that we are trying to entrench about a blameless United States. So these are some of the themes that I identified in the narrative infrastructure of the war on terror. So again, everything changed post 9/11. The idea of civilization and freedom, both as reasons why the United States was attacked, as well as reasons why the United States needs to intervene in other countries. Malleable justice, or in other words, justice is whatever we say it is. Muslim rage, the idea that Muslims harbor inexplicable and irrational rage that cannot be reasoned with. The construction of terrorism and moral equivalencies, and virtues and generosity. And the important point here, and why I focus and have focused so much on the narratives, as well as the reason why Muslim Counterpublics Lab focuses so heavily on the narratives, is because of the ways that the narrative serves to justify state violence. And in the quote on the left, you can see that what Donald Krebs says, and that's actually the book title, Narrative in the Making of U.S. National Security, is that language doesn't compete with or complement power politics. It is power politics. So narratives and language and discourse, they are a form of power. So in analyzing some of these narratives, there is this idea of hijacked victimhood, okay? And I'm sure that this will resonate with some of you or all of you in terms of how it's being used, how we can see it being used right now, especially when it comes to who the threat to this country is. Okay. So, this idea of hijacked victimhood is a way in which dominant groups, right, sort of seize the construction of victimhood. We saw that in some of the previous quotes I've shown, right? And they adopt this position of victimhood in order to justify certain types of violence, to expand and defend their power, and to position the oppressed groups, the people that are in fact the victims, as the oppressors and the threat. And Donald Trump's rhetoric in general is extremely laden with the concept of victimhood. But again, this is a very specific term that I, recently came upon and thought it was a very interesting way to conceive of it, right? Because it's being hijacked, right? Because when we talk about qualitatively and quantitatively, who is the victim? If we were to think about the United States or immigrants, it would be immigrants, right? Marginalized groups are always going to be victims of the state. Civilizational threats. This is often a construction that is, used against Muslims, right? That, Muslims are uncivilized and barbaric. And importantly, when it comes to rallying the entire globe around the US's wars and violence, right? They position Muslims and acts of political violence by Muslims as civilizational threats to say that it's not just a threat to the United States, it's a threat, again, to every country who is a civilized country, of course, i.e., Western countries. And in positioning the threat in that way, then it sort of compels the other countries to get involved in the violence of curbing what they consider the civilizational threat. This is a quote, of course, from Trump. They're poisoning the blood of this country. That's what they've done. They poison mental institutions and prisons all over the world, not just in South America, not just the 3 or 4 countries that we think about, but all over the world. Uh, but all over the world, they're coming into our country from Africa, from Asia, all over the world. They're pouring into our country. And these are very, of course, dangerous narratives, right? Because when we talk about poisoning the blood, this is a very violent narrative because we know the history of this country, right? In terms of what it means to have pure blood, right? And what that cues in terms of white supremacist language. And of course, this is the type of language that is used in other right wing white supremacist dominated countries as well, right? That people like us, like people like immigrants and people from these, quote, third world countries, right, are poisoning our blood. Malleable justice. So these 3 quotes are from 3 different instances. The first is from Biden when Ayman al-Zawahiri was assassinated. Ayman al-Zawahiri, if you don't know, was the number 2 person in Al-Qaeda. The second quote is from Trump after they assassinated Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And the third is from Obama when they assassinated Osama bin Laden. And the reason I bring these up is because, as you can see, all 3 quotes use the word justice. And all 3 of these assassinations were extrajudicial assassinations. And in delivering the news to the American people, they didn't have to talk about any legal rationales or how this could be justifiable from a legal perspective. All they had to say was that these acts, these assassinations were justice, and so they were. And that's important when we deconstruct the concept of justice, right? And who is it justice for? Muslim Rage. These articles are closer to when the attacks of 9/11 actually happened, but this is a narrative that continues to be pervasive in the dominant discourse. And it's really the idea that, of course, Muslims are irrationally angry, as I mentioned. And most importantly, when you construct people, anyone, Muslims in particular, in this case, right, as being irrationally angry and inexplicably angry, what you are actually doing is justifying brute force because you're saying that these people cannot be reasoned with. And if you can't reason with people, then the only other option is brute force. And that's exactly how the United States wants to and has been dealing with the quote Muslim threat. Terrorism. What does it mean? If you read the quote on the right that was given by Sir Jeremy Greenstock, you'll probably be left feeling like anyone who reads this definition that it makes no sense. And there is actually no definition that's being provided. It's tautological. Terrorism is what terrorism looks like and kills like, right? That's not a definition of terrorism. What they were actually saying is terrorism is what we decide terrorism is. And we are going to use that label liberally to inflict violence on whoever it is that we want to construct as a terrorism. And on the quote on the left, this quote is important because it talks about what is the purpose of the construction of terrorism? What is the purpose of that term? And the purpose is to eradicate politics from sub-state political violence. That is to say that there is no political reason why acts of violence constructed as terrorism occur. And when you think about the ways that terrorism as a construct is used to broadly define, for example, Al Qaeda or ISIS or the Taliban or Hamas, the reason why it's so easy to lump them into this construction of terrorism is because their motivations have been depoliticized. And when you depoliticize them, then you get rid of and preclude the possibility of actually understanding what their particular grievances are that are indeed rooted in politics. They are all responding to political conditions and are using violence as a tool of politics. And that is important to understand, especially when all of these groups, including now when you're talking about narco-terrorism, which is a whole nother topic, right? It's to remove the politics and to enable the state to respond to this violence as counterterrorism, which is also depoliticized and becomes more of a tactical intervention to dealing with this violence. So you probably heard about this presidential memorandum in September, and it was specifically about countering domestic terrorism and organized political violence. Importantly, here is that domestic terrorism and organized political violence are lumped into one thing. And it's very interesting because when it is a white perpetrator, somehow the government is able to understand it as political violence. And of course, when it is not a white perpetrator, or when it is a white perpetrator who falls under the guise of something like Antifa, then it becomes domestic terrorism. And another important part here is that when we talk about political violence, terrorism is often sort of constructed as a form of political violence. So, in other words, political violence is the umbrella category under which terrorism falls. So that means that all acts of violence under this guise are political violence, right? But nevertheless, this was an instance in which terrorism and political violence were used, of course, to really uplift a white supremacist, hateful, xenophobe, Islamophobe, anti-Black individual who was spreading very toxic ideas, of course, that were pursuant to creating violent conditions for our communities. And to link those two things together, right? Not only are we going to um, sort of talk about terrorism and organized political violence in a way that benefits the white supremacist state, we are also going to uplift a white supremacist in doing that. And in that way, making the agenda of the United States under the Trump administration very clear. Of course, this is not to say that other administrations haven't been rooted in white supremacy. They have, and they will always be. But this administration has made it entirely and viscerally clear that that is their agenda. We'll skip this one. Moral equivalencies. Um, you've probably seen this sort of narrative and rhetorical tactic in a lot of spaces, but the United States likes to compare its violence to non-state actor violence in the form of saying our violence is not comparable, and that's even if they call their violence violence. But we know that when it comes to state violence versus sub-state or non-state actor violence, the state is always going to win when it comes to death and destruction and the scope, breadth, and depth of the violence. But this rhetorical strategy of moral equivalencies is to say that there cannot be any comparison on a moral level because the violence of the United States is somehow inherently morally superior. Okay. And if you paid attention to any of the narratives around the US Israeli-backed genocide of Palestinians, you would see that rhetoric over and over and over again, and that is to justify the violence and to minimize the very obvious disproportionate amounts of violence that are being leveraged by the state as opposed to non-state actors. So this is three quotes that were said when the Abu Ghraib war crime scandals came out. And the interesting thing here is, and why I called it not a dent in the narrative in my book, is because it really reveals the US's logic that no matter what happens to contradict the idea that America is this benevolent, democratic, generous country, they will still maintain the same line of rhetoric and narrative about the character of this country. So, in the first quote, President Bush talks about, this not being the America that he knows. Rumsfeld talked about the Abu Ghraib war crimes as a openness in the rule of law. And Powell talked about the war crimes as something that you should watch how America would deal with, right? It would be an indication of the character of the United States to see how they actually righted the wrong. In none of these quotes was there concern for the actual victims of the war crimes. And of course, what's missing here is that the United States did not choose to reveal the fact that war crimes had occurred at Abu Ghraib. They were leaked by someone at Abu Ghraib. So Rumsfeld's no, quote about the rule of law, it wasn't by choice. None of this was by choice. And we, in fact, watched how America dealt with it. And 20 years later, actually 21 years later, survivors are still fighting for justice. So we did watch how America dealt with it. And of course, America has continued to maintain its violence and refuse to acknowledge any wrongdoing. Again, not a dent in the narrative. This is a quote that Obama gave after there was a massacre in Afghanistan. And of course, we have to talk about the sacrifices that the US troops made in Afghanistan, as if Afghans asked the United States to come destroy and just, kill all the people in their country. And of course, this is the same narrative, right? That America is this generous, benevolent actor. And it's meant to, of course, rehabilitate the image of the United States, most importantly. This is a picture from when, oh, sorry. And please feel free to let me know if we're short on time, because I know it's uh, reaching 11 here. This is a picture that was taken on January 11th, 2002, when the first Muslim men were sent to Guantanamo after the War on Terror. And the quote that was offered about this picture was that they were very dangerous people and they would gnaw through hydraulic lines in the back of a C-17 to bring it down. As you can see in the picture, these men are being deprived of all their senses. They have a mask on, they have goggles on, they have earmuffs on, their head is covered. And so it's a very interesting quote to give when people are so incapacitated and unable to have any autonomy whatsoever. Never mind the fact that these 20 people that were initially sent to Guantanamo, their identities were mostly unknown, and the United States government didn't really care. So why are they saying they're very dangerous people if we don't even know who they are? Okay. And on top of it, this picture was released intentionally. And the reason why that's important is because at the time, the US government saw nothing wrong with releasing such a picture because they had dehumanized Muslims so much to the extent that they believed if they released this picture, there would not be outrage, right? And certainly not outrage if there were enough to force a policy change. And now we're almost at 24 years of Guantanamo Bay Prison being open still, and with the lives of those transferred out of the prison being completely destroyed. In 2006, some of the three of the Guantanamo men reportedly committed suicide, although most people believe it was homicide. But if we were to take that, what the government claimed had happened, they also complemented the violence of that by saying, in this quote, that these acts of suicide were an act of asymmetrical warfare waged against us. So even in their deaths, even when they claim that they died by suicide, which we could probably see as an unfortunate yet reasonable reaction to being indefinitely detained and tortured, they are still constructed as a threat posthumously. And that is very serious to imagine that even after their deaths, they can be constructed as a threat. So, laws and policies of the war on terror, and I'll try to go through these a little bit more quickly. So, one of the frameworks that I use in my research and work is this idea of social constructions in policy design by Helen Ingram and Ann Schneider. And they really talk about the ways in which constructions of different social groups are embedded into the laws and policies of the government. Now, obviously, not all laws and policies actually say things like this is a policy dedicated to targeting Muslims, right? But there are, in some ways, different constructions of groups that are embedded into these policies. And in the case where they're neutral on their face, you can still see a particular construction being entrenched vis-a-vis implementation. So even though we have this policy that's neutral on its face, who in fact is it being used to target? This is a very good example. I'm sure you've all seen this sort of comparison where there's a Muslim shooter, which equals collective responsibility, a Black shooter means it's gang related, a professional shooter, right? Someone in the army, national hero, or the police, and a white shooter is a lone wolf. You can also think about, for example, drug sentencing policies and which sentences are higher based on which group is thought to use or is more likely to use a particular type of drug, right? Crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, right? What group, so for example, what drug are white people thought, are white people more likely to use versus Black people? And of course, the drug that Black people would be more likely to use is more criminalized. And that has nothing to do with the drug's lethality. It is purely based on who they want to target vis-a-vis the policies. So taxonomy of the war on terror. So how has the war on terror actually been fought and implemented? And so in my book, I talk about it as occurring across 5 dimensions, including militarism and warfare, draconian immigration policies, surveillance, federal terrorism prosecution, and detention and torture. So corporeal violence really pertains to violence against the body, right? It's the very physical violence. And if you see this quote in the bottom, here we have President Obama bragging about how good he is at killing people. Bordered violence. So of course, this is violence pertaining to immigration and the ways that specifically lines are on a map are used to adjudicate humanity. So this is President Trump saying, he's been told not to call immigrants animals, but they are animals, right? They're not humans. Panoptic. This pertains to surveillance, right? And the belief, or at least the right, of being able to have an autonomous life without the fear that the government is surveilling or watching over you. And this picture, this tweet is about a kid named Ahmed the Clock Boy that happened many years ago. He was a very smart Muslim Black boy, I think he was Sudanese, who built a clock at home and brought it to school to show his teachers, thinking they'd be proud. But instead of being proud of Ahmed, they called the police because they thought it was a bomb. President Obama's response was to invite him to the White House, but the irony of this is that President Obama spearheaded the Countering Violent Extremism program, which essentially deputized individuals within their communities to surveil on members of their community. And so Ahmed's arrest was a direct result of President Obama's policies. But of course, President Obama was a master of rhetoric and narrative. So if you didn't look beyond the surface, this is what you would have seen, as opposed to the violence that got Ahmed arrested in the first place. Juridical. So this is when the judicial system is wielded to either um, create conditions of injustice or to disallow any form of justice to occur at all or to bar access to the legal system. And this is a quote from an individual named Tariq Mahanna, who was sentenced to 17 years for material support for terrorism because he was translating Al-Qaeda material independently, and the government argued that he was translating it at their behest. I would recommend reading his sentencing statement. It's very interesting, and it's I think it's very important, specifically because he talks about what his position is, which is that Muslims should be able to defend themselves against foreign invaders, etc. And this is a question that we're dealing with right now, right? Who has the right to resistance? And why is it that only certain forms of resistance are criminalized when others are allowed? Carceral. This is a quote from Donald Rumsfeld, and this pertains also to violence against the body, but the violence of incarceration itself. And this is a quote that Donald Rumsfeld wrote on one of the infamous torture memos, saying that he stands for 8 to 10 hours a day. Why is standing limited to 4 hours? So this was a handwritten note, and you can imagine the sort of violence and cruelty that one would need to harbor in order to write such a thing on a torture memo that already detailed and described the most egregious torture to begin with. I'm sure you're all familiar with these presidential actions, all of which were signed on January 20th, um, which of course have attached the same demonizing narratives of immigrants, right? Whether it's about securing our borders, as if the border isn't already secure, as if there isn't already a wall there, right? And again, back to the hijacked victimhood, all of these presidential executive orders really amp up that victimhood narrative, right? To say that there's a national emergency at the southern border of the United States, and further in the rhetoric, surrounding these executive orders, they talk about an army of invaders, right? And so all of these executive orders were justified and promoted again vis-a-vis the narratives of immigrants and the demonization in particular, of course, of immigrants. This is a way in which I would say our struggles are very interconnected. This picture on the left is of a Muslim man who is being detained at Guantanamo, and this is the picture on the right is of a immigrant or migrant who is being sent to Guantanamo. Both were described as the worst of the worst. And the pictures look almost identical. And that's important because once you create a blueprint for violence, and in particular, the legal justification for that violence, it becomes replicable and under the same linguistic structure. So, for example, these were the two executive orders that initially, right, sort of paved the ground for migrants to be sent to Guantanamo. One of which was designating certain cartels as terrorist organizations, and then the executive order demanding the expansion of Guantanamo Bay Prison. Then, of course, we have the recent Caribbean boat strikes, right, which are being done under the guise of narco-terrorism. And there's an article I read recently, and I can get the citation, in which the author is specifically talking about how the drone wars throughout the War on Terror are part of the ways that the legal precedent was set for these boat strikes to occur in the first place. And as we're seeing this discourse evolving, much of it is about whether or not there was a war crime committed, with analyses, for example, from the Center for Constitutional Rights, pushing back on that analysis, right? Because it isn't a war. And what is getting lost in all of this is that it is a crime, and it is a crime that, in fact, no one will be held accountable for because they never are. Most recently, a few days ago, Trump, as you know, has expanded the travel ban to 39 countries, um, including some with a full immigration ban, some with restricted, and some with full ban, and then some are restricted. So at present, we're at 39 countries. And of course, this goes from just beyond a Muslim ban, right? It's a Muslim ban, African ban, um, South American ban. And if you see the language again in this particular executive order, you will see the same rhetoric that's being used, right? And that's why, again, these are important windows for us to really work together on because of the ways that they really target all of our communities using the same overarching demonizing language. So I think I'll stop after these last two slides. So this is some graffiti that was painted in Sana'a, Yemen. And as you can see, it says in English, "Why did you kill my family?" with a US drone, and it says the same thing in Arabic. I juxtaposed that graffiti against two quotes from President Bush and President Obama, both talking about the 9/11 attacks being evil. And the reason why I juxtapose the quotes against the image is because, number one, evil is a very particular word. It's not bad. Evil is meant to construct the idea that certain people are inherently bad, right? Evil means something that's inherent, and you cannot dislodge evil from a person because it's just a part of their nature. And it's interesting that a country that has been waging drone warfare on Yemen, on Pakistan, on Somalia, is the one that gets to define what evil is and what it looks like. And this is indicative of the power of rhetoric and narrative, because whoever gets to define the terms of the war gets to wage the violence with zero accountability. And then finally, when I think about whether or not the war on terror is over, as the US government often likes to claim it is, I include this quote from a young Pakistani boy who gave testimony in 2013 in a congressional hearing about drone warfare, in which he says, "I no longer love blue skies. In fact, now prefer gray skies. The drones do not fly when the skies are gray. When the sky brightens, drones return, and we live in fear." So whenever the United States talks about a war ending, it's often because there are no quote troops on the ground, when in fact there usually are troops on the ground, and never mind the quote over the horizon capabilities in which the United States can simply operate war from a distance and in the air. Um, but also because war is not just about the absence of these violent forces. War ending is about the ability of a people to live in relative peace and without the fear that they will be targeted, their families will be targeted because of the probability of violence from a country like the United States. So the war on terror will be over when young Muslim children and children across the globe do not correlate the color of the sky with the probability of violence. And I will stop there. Thank you all so much.
I would like to thank you, Dr. Maha, for the presentation. And again, I think that it's worth to read the book and kind of maybe look at this presentation again